thank you all for joining us for this month's edition of Wild at Work, a stewardship series. Today we have Mr. Shane Mahoney joining us. Shane is the president of Conservation Visions and founder of the Wild Harvest Initiative. He is an internationally recognized conservationist and is considered a foremost expert in the North American model of wildlife conservation. Shane serves as deputy chair of IUCN's Sustainable Use and Livelihoods Specialist Group and as the IUCN representative to the Collaborative Partnership on Sustainable Wildlife Management. He also serves as president of the Policy and Law Division for International Council of Game and Wildlife Conservation and is a fellow of the Wildlife Society. And I believe, Shane, you're in Louisville right now at the Wildlife Society meeting. Is that correct?
That is correct. A very busy meeting it is, and a very productive one, I must say. So I'm glad to be able to find the window to be able to make this presentation to you. And thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, well, we thank you for giving your time and are excited to hear what you have to say. And so, despite some unusual start to our webinar, we're excited to have you. And I'll go ahead and hand the reins off to you.
Okay, so just for those individuals who have joined, other than your two hosts there, we've been having some difficulties, and I cannot actually see the screen that includes all of you. I can only see my presentation at this point in time. So I will run through this presentation, and after obviously we stop sharing the screen, then hopefully we'll be able to sort of rejoin one another in common. So if that's all right with everybody, then I will get underway. Is that all good for everyone?
Yeah, Shane, most our folks are going to have to stay muted and with their videos off for the entirety of the presentation, so it works out pretty well. If they have any questions, and anyone who is watching, if you have questions, you can use the chat function on Zoom, and we'll get those questions to Shane at the end of the presentation.
Okay, that's absolutely perfect. Well, my topic for presentations today is this entity, this undertaking, this program that I launched called the Wild Harvest Initiative. And it's very much centered around the idea of the value of land, the services that wildlife and wild creatures provide to us, sometimes in many ways that we sort of take for granted. And it is also associated with a desire on my part to find ways of explaining to the broad public the value of these wild resources and to find channels of communication between myself and the public that are not contrived or forced or awkward, but which deal with commonplace concerns that all of us as human beings share. We have, as you know, all of you, come through a period of time, and the pattern continues to increase, where people all over the world are becoming more focused upon health, longevity, more concerned about food security, food quality, where food comes from, and so forth, which of course is an ancient, old, evolutionary need for our species, just like all others. And when I began to search for a channel of communication between the work that I do in the wildlife conservation space and the general public, I seized upon this current trend in society, which, as I said, is global. It's not just taking place in the United States. I seized upon this trend of health and longevity and good food precisely because it was not a trend that was established by the conservation community. It was a trend established by broader patterns of social change and social discourse, but it offered up a method, a carrier, a train, a pony, some mode of vehicle by which our story around the wild harvesting of nature in all its forms, including hunting, could in fact be expressed to modern society. So the Wild Harvest Initiative is new in that it's never ever been attempted by anyone. It is completely different from all the game dinners and other programs like it that you may think are similar. which deal with recipe books and game dinners and things of this nature. This is a data-driven process that borrows from the processes of data acquisition and compilation of our state and provincial and territorial agencies who are responsible for the management of wildlife in Canada and the United States. Now, all of you have a certain level of understanding of the history of conservation in North America. You know that after Europeans came here, that there was an overwhelming sense of awe at the sheer abundance of wildlife, an overwhelming sense of awe at what seemed to be the limitlessness of the continent, the vastness of the land. And of course, there was a belief carried from the old world to the new by many of these individuals who came from particular religious points of view, who were very much instilled with the notion that man had dominion over nature, that an advanced society moved nature to the background and brought human endeavor to the foreground, and that, of course, in the emerging sense of Americanism, the emerging sense of an identity for the United States and for Canada, there was the idea, of course, that one of the responsibilities of the citizen in our countries, Canada and the United States, was actually, in a way, to subdue nature, to push it to the side, and to develop a kind of Jeffersonian view of the world of the small plot farmer, with nature somewhat excluded and food and everything else being raised by the individual. But along the way, there was also this realization that this magnificent abundance of wildlife was also very attractive to very wide, large markets, both in the burgeoning eastern regions of the United States and Canada, and also, of course, the markets in Europe for all kinds of products, whether they be products of meat or products of hides or products of skulls or whatever the products might be. These couple of examples that you see on the slide before you of the massive numbers of buffalo hides about to be sent down the rivers for distribution to the points, and also the massive mound of bison skulls that were to be reduced to fertilizer. These are just obviously examples of what was going on and involved many, many different kinds of species. The thing is that as a species, we rely on nature, don't we? I mean, we are inseparable from that natural system, just like every other species is. And therefore, for all of our history of 200,000 years as a species that looks just like us, we rely directly on those species for food and for clothing and for other commercial and cultural interests. Agriculture has only been around 11,000 years, so the vast majority of our triad life was this actually harvesting of wild species. You see here in some of the figures that are identified in the small graph that is associated under the top two right figures, an example of what actually happened eventually in response to that excessive killing of wildlife, a burgeoning awakening of the need for a conservation movement in the United States and Canada at a time where many of the iconic species that we think of, such as pronghorn or bison or elk or wild turkey or bighorns or whitetails, and I could have added others, these animals at the early part of the 20th century were at the nadir of their numbers, the lowest point of their numbers that anyone had ever recorded. And in fact, it was considered highly likely that every single one of them was headed towards extinction. This was the belief, that every single one of these animals was headed for extinction. And that's why the Boone and Crockett Club eventually established, of course, this display of heads and horns and said to people coming in to visit these mounted animals, come and see America's vanishing wildlife. Well, the new ethos that developed around conservation led to a remarkable recovery in some species. And of course, you see on the right the numbers, the comparable numbers of pronghorn and bison and whitetails and elk, et cetera, that we now enjoy on this continent today. And we live now, again, on a continent with an extraordinary abundance of wildlife that we can benefit from in many, many ways. Not sure why that will not shift. So, the wild harvesting of animals is an ancient tradition. The wild harvesting of animals and other products from nature was something that played a significant part and role in the history of the United States of America and of Canada, and still plays a vital role in many, many debates. But we sometimes forget the broad benefits that are associated with wildlife harvest, not just in this part of the world, but globally. And the truth of the matter is that to this day, in 2023, the wild harvest of both animals and plants, fruits, nuts, berries, and other products from nature, that these contribute to the food security and livelihoods, the human health and wellness, well-being, and to various processes of conservation, as well as helping maintain the health of animal populations themselves and providing thereby a whole array of ecosystem services to billions of people around the world. This is not a sideshow. This is not something that because you and I have become accustomed to going to the grocery store and buying our meat or other products neatly packaged far away from where the products often are grown, this in no way changes the reality on the planet where billions of people are still directly reliant on wild harvested products for their sustenance and for their livelihoods, and in fact, for the continuation of their cultures. If you want to have the very quickest access to that kind of notion with an empirical database associated with it, think of global fisheries, the pursuit of sentient wild creatures in the oceans of the world, upon which about somewhere around 2 to 4 billion people rely for sustenance, and somewhere around 600 million or more people rely directly for their economic benefits. In other words, despite all of the changes that have taken place, we are certainly not separated from our direct dependence upon nature in any way, shape, or form. To bring this back to the North American system, and in particular the issue of wild animal harvesting in North America, we know that this is a fairly controversial issue. It has many components to the debate. It has many people who feel that, that this is not something that we should continue to do. Some people worry about a depleting population, etc. There is, suffice it to say, there is a debate, and there are many valuable viewpoints around this debate. Suffice it to say also that the activities that do occur, the wild harvesting activities that do occur in the United States and Canada and Europe and other parts of the world that are more of a recreational nature, not pure subsistence, these rely essentially on public support. And without that public support, the political support is not there. So ultimately, many of these activities that we associated with turkey hunting or other forms of hunting and angling in the United States and Canada really are ultimately dependent upon the public deciding that that is an appropriate thing to do. Very recently, just a few weeks ago, we saw the release of the latest survey on hunting and angling patterns in the United States, released by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. That data is complicated because methodologies were suddenly changed in this review. So what I'm going to speak about here is the data that goes back from 2016 to 1991. I want you to all understand that as we integrate the new data that has just become available, some of these patterns may change, but not all of them certainly. And some of the most significant patterns to watch in what we have uncovered here is that, of course, if you look at the top bar graph, you will see that participation in hunting has in fact been declining, and in angling, in fact, has been declining if you look at the data from 1991 to 2016. In fact, if you look at over that period of time alone, then we lost in the United States about 2.2 million hunters. Now, as you all know, with the COVID years, there seemed to be a resurgence in the number of people who are participating in these kinds of activities, and we are completely uncertain as to whether or not those kinds of trends are going to be maintained as we go forward into the future. But these data are the data that were available up until 2016 and before the latest survey. What's more important, in fact, than the actual numbers that you see here are the two bottom graphs. And what the two bottom graphs actually illustrate is the demographics of the participation community in the activity of hunting in the United States of America. And what it clearly shows is that just as between 1991 and 2016, the overall numbers of participants declined, we see a very significant shift in the number of young people participating in the activity and the number of older people. And the number of younger people participating in the activity has been undergoing a consistent decline over that time period, that 25-year time period between 1990 essentially and 2015, and a significant increase in the older age classes participating in these activities. Any of you who are biologists and have any understanding of the role demographics plays in population dynamics will realize that these trends unchecked, these trends unaltered, these trends not being turned around can only lead us to one continuous decline in the number of people who are participating in these activities. And the consequences of that, of course, will be very significant. Why would it be very significant? Because this activity is a incredible part of a vibrant economy in the United States, employs a huge number of people in rural areas of the country in particular, and it's the same in Canada. And as we will show, provides an enormous amount of wild, nutritious food to millions and millions of people in the country, and also provides an incentive to the general populace in Canada and the United States to conserve land and conserve wildlife populations because of that ecosystem service that is actually being derived from the acquisition of wild meat of those landscapes. Now, I started the Wild Harvest Initiative for a variety of reasons. First of all, I was very interested, as somebody who came from a very rural setting on the island of Newfoundland and who grew up eating wild foods primarily and raising our own vegetables and so on and so forth. I'm very interested in that lifestyle and very interested in exploring how that lifestyle that I grew up with has now been seen as an attractive one by growing numbers of people all around the world, many of whom are urbanites, who are very concerned about the quality of their food, as I said earlier, and very concerned about the possibility of diseases that may be caused by either inferior food quality, shortage of food, or contaminants in food that arise through industrialized agricultural practices. So I was particularly interested in trying to get an understanding of how big was this wild harvest that we have in Canada and the United States. And I tell you that my first foray into this, and I have a lot of experience in this conservation field, I've been a long time in it, I thought for sure that this data existed, that somewhere the Canadian Wildlife Service, the US Fish and Wildlife Service, the Geological Survey, or some entity would have actually had this information in hand of how much wild food recreational hunters and anglers, etc., actually take from the environment on a sustainable basis each year. To my surprise, I discovered that that was not the case, and that in fact nobody had this information at all. And I am a firm believer that if we want to change policies, we want to affect change, we have to do a lot more than host game dinners and a lot more than produce cookbooks, etc. They're all good things. We have to have data to show policymakers and politicians that there is a reason, there is a reason why they should pay attention to this particular issue. So I launched what I consider to be really the first science-based advocacy program for this issue of wild harvesting in North America, looking at the food benefits, the economic benefits, the conservation benefits, and the broader social benefits that derive from these activities in nature and which are very much part of the culture of the United States and Canada. I believe further that by building this kind of realization of how much benefit was being derived from nature, that we would develop better management plans and better management planning overall for landscapes, because ultimately landscapes are what provide support for all animal and plant diversity. And therefore, if we are to keep this diversity and keep components of it that we can benefit directly from, then of course we have to pay greater attention to the value of land itself, public and private land. I am a firm believer that we need a transformation in how our agencies and our governments look at land. And one of the things they have to start to consider as they develop this new perspective is just how much wild food is actually provided from these lands, and indeed how much wild food could be provided if we changed our management structures, and just how big the economies are associated with this wild harvesting, and just how important that wild harvesting is to the cultural identity of not only tribal peoples and indigenous peoples and First Nations peoples, as we variously refer, but also to all of us who have developed cultures in the Southeast, in the West, in the Northeast, everywhere across the United States and everywhere across Canada. So this was my intention and my hope when I started this program. I also, however, wanted to point out to people in North America that this is not just a North American phenomenon, and that we actually have major programs in existence worldwide which are very much preoccupied with this idea of sustainable use of natural resources and how sustainable use of natural resources actually incentivizes conservation, and how we have a collective responsibility to safeguard natural systems so that they can provide for not just wildlife and the other components of nature that are out there, but that they should provide for humanity too in a sustainable way, and in a way that incentivizes humanity to do the right thing for nature. And so you see on this slide here, and I identify that we live and hunt in a global village. Opinions of people far away have an impact on what we do in North America. The opinions we have in North America can have an impact on what happens elsewhere. Those impacts can be positive, or those impacts can be negative for nature, but we have to know and be aware that we can be influencing and are influencing one another on a continuous basis. I also believe that if we were to be effective in supporting the idea of sustainable use and so forth, then we needed to have information and stories from everywhere. And we needed in North America to know where this debate is headed in the global community. So I have listed here the Convention on Biodiversity, the Collaborative Partnership in Sustainable Wildlife Management, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the Convention on Migratory Species, the Intergovernmental Science and Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. I've listed some of the most formidable channels of exchange and study and research and information, the most influential partners that exist on the planet that ultimately impact entities such as the United Nations and world governments about the decisions that we make. And all of these, my point here is, all of these are to some extent preoccupied with the issue of the sustainable use of natural resources and how they benefit people, and how ultimately they benefit landscapes and benefit wildlife, and ultimately complete the circle to allow for beneficial ecosystem services to people worldwide. Now, the Wild Harvest Initiative itself began with its focus, of course, upon hunting and angling, but we are branching out into all items that are harvested in nature, wild berries, wild fruits, medicinal plants, wild rices, cultural attributes, etc., by both tribal peoples and others, because I believe that that entire community is the community we should be talking to. And I think that entire community is much more representative of society at large than simply just the hunting community or just the angling community. This effort is, however, very much linked, as you see, with the idea of human nature-based benefits and the idea of wildlife conservation. In other words, if the users on the left, and this could also include other harvesters, as I mentioned, if they can understand that the commodities, if you will, the benefits that they have access to on the right, on the third circle on the right in this graph, actually come together and can be understood as human nature-based benefits, then the users of those resources will be incentivized to explain to policymakers and to politicians that those landscapes matter, those wildlife species matter, and of course, by bringing an ecosystem focus to this, all systems matter, all species matter, because collectively they are necessary for thriving ecosystems. And it is from those thriving ecosystems, marine, terrestrial, freshwater, that human beings extract all of these many benefits of time in the outdoors and all of the health benefits that accrue, and also the acquisition of very healthy supplies of food in very many ways. Now, the other hope for me in this process is if we can expand the community of advocacy from beyond just hunters and anglers to include the berry pickers and include all of the groups that are utilizing wildlife in some way, harvesting wildlife in some way, including, I would argue, harvesting beauty, which is ultimately why we go to nature, then I think we have a much better chance of building a much wider constituency in support of the conservation of nature and the conservation of land. So, of course, naturally, there is a very significant part of the Wild Harvest Initiative that focuses upon the issues of communication and dialogue and reaching people. And that is why I am involved in these international conventions and other processes that I referred to earlier, so we can bring our story to the world and the world's story to us. So what does the Wild Harvest Initiative, what does the Wild Harvest Initiative actually do? The Wild Harvest Initiative sets out to do a number of very specific things. First of all, we want to quantify the total amount of wild meat and fish procured annually by hunters and anglers in the United States and Canada. I want to stress that every single thing I'm going to tell you here is new. It has never been done. It's never been done in either country by any entity. And therefore, what we are presenting to the world is a brand new story. And that's important because there are a lot of stories out there, and we need new stories, and we need new and impactful stories to safeguard nature. So we want to quantify the total amount of wild meat and fish procured. We want to calculate what we call a social sharing index. All of you realize that when we harvest wild foods, we share them with people. Well, we want to know the extent of that. We want to know the motivations for that. We want to know why would people be interested in sharing wild meat that they harvest, but would never dream of going to a grocery store and buying a roast of meat and walking up to their neighbor up the street and say, hey, I just bought you a strip loin roast. But when we hunt a deer, when we harvest a moose, when we harvest ducks or wild turkeys, that is one of the things that we are driven to do, the same with wild berries and fruits. We wanted to better understand the pure health benefits of all of this wild harvesting from an exercise and outdoors experience point of view, but also from the benefits of these nutrient-laden, cholesterol essentially free, and very low fat and high in mineral kinds of foods, which are the natural foods that your evolutionary performance physiologically was actually developed for. We also want to determine the economic and environmental consequences of replacing this. Let's say it goes away. Let's say we all stop gathering these wild foods. What really would be the cost to society if we actually did that? And where would the food come from? We also wanted to form a very unique Wild Harvest Partnership Alliance. Real partners, partners providing money, partners providing expertise, partners who are committed in the long term to getting this kind of information out. That was another major emphasis point for us. And ultimately, of course, we want to take all of this information and to use it through scientific and popular publications and social media, etc., to get this information out to the public, to suddenly shock people into realizing just how much wild food we are actually harvesting from these natural systems, And of course, to remind people that if we had not done the many things we have done to rescue wildlife in the past and to maintain natural areas in our two countries, then of course we would never have the opportunity to do this harvesting. And furthermore, we wanted to use all of this to build a much broader, a newer, more inclusive valuation of fish and wildlife so that people would look at land differently and that we could mobilize a much wider community of people in support of it. Because Canada and the United States, through the North American model, have set up very similar kinds of data gathering systems for hunted species and fish species and so on and so forth in both countries, we are able to access relatively similar data from all Canadian provinces and territories and all American US jurisdictions. Think about this. If Canada and the United States had developed very different kinds of approaches, or if every state had developed a very different kind of approach in accumulating this data over time, something like the Wild Harvest Initiative would be nearly impossible. But we are able to go to every one of those states and territories and provinces and so on, and essentially extract the same kind of information, which is the information on species that are harvested, often at the demographic level, adult male versus adult female, juvenile, and so on. And from the academic literature, therefore, we were able to go and find out what the average live mass, average edible mass, average dressed mass of all these species are. And we've created now a database that has 5 years of data. We're building towards 10. 5 years of data contains 70,000 records, but those records mean of tens upon tens upon tens of millions of individual animals harvested, but 17,000 species records that we have amassed over time. And that is the basis, of course, from which all of our calculations are established. Now, if you think you have trouble dealing with a single government agency sometimes, then I encourage you to think about what it's probably like to be dealing with 52 agencies, which is what we have been doing. What does this enable us to do? It enables us to do things that nobody else has ever been able to do before. No one could ever tell us before how many species we actually even harvested in Canada and the United States, let alone how many of each species across that entire jurisdiction. These are just examples. That's all they are, to show you what our database is capable of. We can interrogate this database upside down and inside out with regard to species, state, province, region, country, continent, whatever we want to do for every species that is harvested in Canada and the United States. This was never possible before, with the exception of waterfowl, where some effort was made, but for the broad range of species that are harvested in the two countries, this just was simply not possible. And what does this kind of harvest look like? Well, if you look annually between the years of 2014 and 2019, in the United States of America, you have harvested about 61 million animals sustainably each year, with a live biomass, as you can see, of 1.2 billion pounds. That leads ultimately to 1.4 billion meals annually in your country at 6-ounce servings. If we used a 4-ounce calculation, it would be a lot more. As you can see, in Canada, of course, the numbers are much lower. Far fewer people who actually live there and far fewer people who actually hunt. But even still, 138 million meals on an annual basis just for meat, not including fisheries, is actually what accrues as a result of this activity. Now, we looked at this and we said, well, okay, let's say in the United States, we don't have this wild meat anymore, and we have to replace this wild meat with other sources of animal protein. We looked at the consumption patterns of American buyers in terms of the meat they harvest: chicken, beef, pork, turkey, lamb, veal, etc. And this graph here gives you an indication of how many millions of pounds, extra pounds, of those industrial commodities that would have to be provided in order to replace the wild food that is currently being harvested by recreational hunters just in the United States of America. And so you see the massive increase in the numbers of domestic animals that would need to be harvested in order to replace this wild food. And as a result of that, you can see that to do so in a given year would really require about $2 billion a year to actually buy the agricultural replacements, if you will, if the wild meat harvesting in the United States stopped tomorrow for any particular reason. Now, we have not only worked on wild meat, we did a major review of fishing in Canada and looked at a long time series of data to see what was happening in that space, because of course there's a lot of wild food gathered through recreational fishing. And we're looking at the United States currently, but we have now finished the work in Canada. And what this work shows is that there is a very substantial difference by region in the provinces of Canada, just as there is in the states of the United States of America, in terms of, how much fish is recreationally harvested from the fresh waters of that country. And we looked at that data from 1975 to about 2015. And the results showed that over that time period, on an annual basis, about 139 million fish were harvested. This is just in Canada, generating about 192 million pounds of absolutely pure, wonderful wild fish, which would have had a retail cost in Canada on an annual basis of $2.3 billion. So as you can see, I repeatedly say, this is no sideshow. What also was interesting, however, when we looked at this, is that there has really been a very significant decrease over time in participation by both residents and non-residents up until 2015. We're updating this data now. There has been a very big decrease in the participation rates by residents and non-residents in recreational fishing in Canada. And this is an alarming statistic, obviously, but again, it's one of those examples of where we did not know all of this information before. And if we're to plan for these exigencies, then of course we have to have that data. And if you look at the differences, in 1985, we were harvesting about 305 million pounds of, we say meat, but 305 million pounds of fish. By 2015, this was down to 75 million pounds. So, we are seeing a very significant decrease in not only the participation in fishing, but also obviously in the harvesting of fish. Now, what's really interesting about this, of course, is that what's also tied up with it is that more and more people are tending to release more and more fish. In other words, they're still fishing, but they're retaining far fewer fish on average than they used to. And this is an interesting intersection because we came up with the idea of catch and release fishing, and it became an ethos for the angling community. It was a good thing to do. It was a conservation thing to do. But what we have found is that catch and release of fish from recreational harvesting in Canada, the releasing of fish has gone from about 35% of all fish caught in 1985 to 71% of all fish caught in 2015. In other words, a massive shift, along with these declines in participation, a massive shift in the release of fish not being consumed. It's vitally important to point out that this is not because the fish populations in Canada cannot sustain the harvest they used to be able to sustain, but because an interjected, well-intentioned conservation ethos model, catch and release, has had one unintended consequence, I suppose, which is that far, far fewer fish are kept for consumption, and therefore those people have a much greater reliance on purchasing similar products in the grocery stores rather than consuming the fish they catch themselves. It's an interesting point. We should be careful often about the kinds of ideas we have when we think they are in the best interest of wildlife and sustainable use and the conservation of the resource, et cetera, when in fact there can really be unintended consequences. One of the things, as I said in the opening, that we wanted to do and that we have done is that we have been conducting surveys across the country in various states that are partners of ours, looking at just how much wild food is actually being shared by individuals in those regions. We have completed these surveys in Texas, Alaska, Arizona, Wyoming, Nevada, and we have surveys planned for Missouri and for Indiana, and hopefully for some other states relatively soon. And of course, we had a whole variety of interests here. We wanted to know the number of hunters who shared wild harvested meat. We wanted to know the number of individuals with the wild meat was shared. We wanted to know what species were shared and what proportion of the wild meat was actually shared with people. And we also wanted to know what motivated the hunters to do this and to evaluate then the role of wild harvested meat in terms of household meat consumption. You see what we're trying to do here. We're trying to take this data and we're trying to see how far the ripple effect of this harvesting extends into society. Let's say we have 12 million people or 13 million, whatever the number you choose, that participate in hunting activity in the United States. Well, just imagine if they share that, as I will show you the statistics, with many more people. Then many more people are actually benefiting from that activity, both within the hunter's household, his or her household, but also with people outside the household. And that means that those people outside the household and inside who are accepting that wild meat, to some extent, we can debate how large an extent, but to some extent they are showing that they are in support of these kinds of activities. Plus, it allows us to a model by which to explore how can we get more wild foods produced on more private and public lands and reach more people with that kind of natural food production system. Am I suggesting we can replace industrialized agriculture with these harvests? No. Am I saying that we can increase the amount of that wild harvest for people on public and private lands? Absolutely. And we could probably do it at a fairly significant level, I firmly believe. If you look at some of the results from these surveys, in Texas, Wyoming, Nevada, and Arizona, we don't have the Alaska data up here yet, but as you can see, fairly large numbers of people, and depending on how many harvesters you have, of course, but somewhere between 2.2 and 2.4 people inside the household share that meat, other than the man or woman who hunted the animal itself. And if you look at outside the household, the numbers are even larger, between 3.5 and 4.2 people. So let's say on average, the 13 million people, or say, let's say 14 million people who hunt in the United States of America, on average shared their wild meat with 4 people. Well, that is 4 times the 14. That is 56 million people who are actually consuming that wild meat. And that puts a very different policy and political perspective over that institution and over that occurrence than is the case if you're talking about just 13 or 14 million people. And bear in mind, we plan to do this for wild berries, for wild fruits, for wild honey, for wild syrup, for wild leeks, for shed antlers, for firewood, for all those kinds of things that are collected from nature. And we are going to expose a massive economy of a tremendous benefit to people in the United States and Canada that hitherto has really not been explored. If you look at the kinds of amount of food that is being shared inside and outside the households in the various states in which we've done this work, then you can also see here, of course, on this slide, just what those numbers actually look like. And certainly, it shows that, you know, about 15 to 37% of all of the meat that hunters harvest is actually shared outside the household. That may be to friends and neighbors, coworkers. It could be to people at food banks who are disadvantaged in some way. it could flow through many channels, and we're going to be working with sociologists to look at that in considerably more detail. As I've said from the outset of this presentation, one of the really big things we want to discover is this finding of natural allies. If you look at this slide here, you see the many kinds of activities that we have in nature. For those of you who have concerns about hunting itself and about that the tide that lifts all boats, many of these activities that you see here, the berry picking, the mushroom harvesting, the firewood harvesting, the wildflower harvest, and so on and so forth, these are broadly, widely accepted, healthful, positively viewed activities in society. Hunting can be a little bit controversial at times among some sectors, but by showing this sort of collective community that's involved in this activity, we think it is an opportunity to rise all of these activities into the public domain and to raise their profile with people and to recruit people into what we know is a healthy engagement with nature and with the outdoors. This essentially kind of leads us to a very old idea, an old philosophy that is gaining momentum around the world, which is that we ought to be looking at the earth from a one health philosophy, a new vision for wildlife, people, and the environment, where human health, environmental health, and animal health are all considered together. And our policies, our investments, our research, our understandings, our communications, our political efforts, they should all be directed towards this simple but very important model. We are part way to it, and we're hoping that the Wild Harvest Initiative, of course, is going to add more emphasis and allow us to move even further in that kind of a direction. It's a really simple idea. It's very similar to the notions that First Nations and tribal peoples have had forever. It's very similar to what rural people and small farmers and small fishermen and boat fishermen and people like this take for granted and understand because they live in the environment. We need to find a way to expand this to the consciousness of a much wider array of people, including the many people who are living today, the increasing number of people who are living today in urban settings. There are challenges to this kinds of concept, of course. We have mental models, we have ingrained ideas about what can work and what should work. You know, we don't listen to indigenous peoples often enough at many times. We often feel our politicians are very distant from us and very divided, which they certainly are. But the truth of the matter is, you know, the world population since 1960 has more than doubled. We have lost 800,000 square kilometers of forested land in that time. At the same time, we have added more than 1 million square kilometers of agricultural land, which by and large has reduced biodiversity significantly. And of course, we have the greatest threat to all of our future is this idea of land use change in general for various reasons, including issues of climate change. I want a world where people value land. I want a world where all people value land and where all people understand that land is the source of life for all of biodiversity, including humanity. And every time we make a decision about land, we make a decision that impacts that future. That is not represented strongly enough in our policies and our legislation today. I worked in government for 33 years, and I can say that without fear of contradiction. We have built, as promised, quite an extraordinary partnership here that includes state agencies, some of the biggest names in the outdoor industry, state governments. We now have federal agencies. The U.S. Forest Service is a major partner. We have just had our first European partners join us, and now we have a major philanthropic organization based in the UK that wants us to take this model to Southern and Eastern Africa. So this idea, born out of the North American context and using North American information, is doing exactly what I said I wanted it to do when I started it, which is helping to influence thinking, not only at home, but in other parts of the world. So, as our mantra suggests, eat wild and live free. There's a lot more to be learned about the Wild Harvest Initiative, but I'm very grateful to TWA for giving me the chance to present it today. And now I'm going to take the delicate step of stopping my sharing to see if I can reconnect